Well, welcome to question 104 of the Secunda Secundae. The topic for this lecture is obedience, and I am Dr. Thibault. So when we look at obedience, obedience is under the cardinal virtue of justice. We are under the part of justice, the potential part of justice, which is observance. And now we are looking at obedience as a virtue. Now, St. Thomas doesn't go into this, although I would have quoted St. Isidore of Seville, etymology. To obey is obedie. Anybody who's in religious life, who's been discerning, taking the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, would have studied obedience, obedie, which from the Latin to, and audire, which means to listen, to listen. So obedience in our current secular interpretation might be more might be different compared to the Latin. So if you look at it from a secular perspective, there's some Marxism that sneaks into here, isn't there? Some level of obedience is to be oppressed, is to be a cog in the machine, is to just do what you're told and don't think, don't have any type of end in yourself, don't have any type of self-worth. Just to be, to obey is to be a slave, right? That's kind of this Marxist approach to obedience, whereas obey in a classical approach means to listen. Now, it's not simply listening and forgetting, right? This could be taken too far in the other direction, right? It is not to be subjected outright, but it's also not to listen and ignore. It's to listen and to adapt, right, and to follow, to serve in some way. But it isn't either of the extremes. Now, the letter to the Hebrews, obey your prelates and be subject to them. Right? So there is an automatic presumption that we should be obeying, right? Obeying is a good thing to superiors, and there's many different types of superiors, as we've discussed multiple times. You know, you have your bosses, right? You have your spouse, you have your church leaders, you have your politicians, right? There's many ways in which we obey. And the principle is that the higher moves the lower to the will in virtue. So this idea that our politicians, our leaders, the purpose of law, as I've said multiple times, according to Aristotle, is to direct man towards virtue. That is the purpose of law. So somebody who's properly in authority is directing people to their proper end. It's directing people towards virtue. It's directing people towards beatitudo. So because of this, the Lord allows certain people to be in these positions of authority, but now the pressure is on them to obey God and direct people towards virtue. But there is a hierarchy in a sense. We are all not figuring it out on our own. There's a proper order which kind of directs us towards the common good and to our own personal ends as well. Salvation. It's part of this kind of natural law, right? Thomas says, according to natural and divine law. So built into natural law and divine law, inferiors are bound to obey their superiors, right? So this has this natural way about it. Now we can see it in two ways. One way, we have people. Well, in one way, God seems to. St. Thomas is talking about inferiors following the superiors. but in some ways, God seems to always pick the inferiors to do His will, right? God picks uh, David, not the little boy, were not the big strong brothers to do His will. God picks Moses, the stutterer. God picks the broken. God picks the shepherds, the ones with no power, in order to show His power. Right. So to be an inferior is not a negative thing in the divine plan. Sometimes God picks them. It's often the lowly who cast down the mighty. So so it's not a blind obedience, but there is a natural order to things. Not everybody is called to be King David. Not everybody is called to be casting down power. If you are, you'll know it. um, but there's a natural order. On the other side of it, two things. The other one is even Christ himself submits himself to Pontius Pilate and Herod. Christ himself submits to the powers to be, the religious powers in some sense, and definitely to the secular powers. The garden on the Mount of Olives, Christ could have ran, but he didn't. He could have not entered Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, but he did, out of obedience, that he did that. So to say, well, we shouldn't be obedient, we should rebel. Well, there's some level of obedience. Should we just blindly always obey everything? Well, then we have the stories of the King David's where we're called to the 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 lowly are called to cast down the mighty from their thrones. Magnificat. St. Thomas flushes this out, though. St. Gregory, St. Thomas is quoting St. Gregory a lot in this, and he's on fire. He's great at this. He has wonderful quotes. When we humbly give way to another's voice, we welcome ourselves, we overcome ourselves in our own hearts. Why obey? Because it helps us to overcome pride. That's great. Right? We're not obeying for the sake of the superiors. We're obeying for the sake of our own uh, transformation of ourselves, for our own virtue. Now, is obedience a special virtue? It always sounds like yes. Seems to always be. A special virtue is assigned to all good deeds that have special reason of praise. That's according to St. Thomas. So, that there's a special reason to praise is enough of a reason to call it a special virtue, which is why most virtues end up becoming special virtues when he asks that question. Obedience does have a special aspect of praiseworthiness because by reason of its object. So because a person is a superior, therefore obedience of that person of superior character, position, it is particularly praiseworthy. So by you are a religious, if we use the story of a religious, when your superior is Mother Teresa, being obedient to Mother Teresa is particularly praiseworthy because of the object, which is Mother Teresa, right? You are following a saint, therefore, being obedient to a saint is better than just being obedient to anyone, right? And this is this obedience in a general sense, which St. Thomas brings up at the end of response to objection one, which is, you can have a general attitude of obedience to everyone, which would make it a general virtue, right? If the idea is that you are obedient to everyone, well, then that's general. But if you say, you know, as a religious, I'm taking obedience to my superior, then that's a particular person in a particular position. If you are in the military, you are being obedient to your superior is in a particular way. So, and it's particular praiseworthiness. If it's to a general, it's because of their military expertise. If it's to a politician, it's because of their political expertise. If it's to a religious, it's because of their spiritual expertise, right? It's their particular. So the obedience is special. Unless it's not, unless you're doing it, unless you treat everyone that way, and then it's a general virtue. Now, obedience, the article number 3, is obedience the greatest virtue? St. Thomas really says no. Obedience should, another one of these great lines from St. Gregory, obedience should be practiced not out of servile fear, but from a sense of charity, not through fear of punishment, but through love of justice. Now, that's a wonderful line. Um, uh, it's not that the obedience is so great, but if you are doing obedience out of charity or out of justice, well, justice and charity are so great. It's just obedience is your way of participating in charity or justice, which are the greater virtue. So it's not the greatest virtue. Charity would be a greater virtue. It's just this is one species of the way in which you can practice charity. Now, the same way, sin is man contemning, the archaic way of saying contemning God and adhering to material goods. Whereas virtue is contemning the created goods and adhering to God. This is kind of one of these logical steps. Sometimes St. Thomas does these logical steps. Step 1, step 2, step 3, and now you get your conclusion. This is step 1. So adhering to God primarily is the proper approach versus material goods. Now, what can you contemn, uh, which would direct us more towards God? Now, we look at these levels. St. Thomas looks at these levels all the time. The first is the soul, which is the highest, then your body, which is second, and then your external things, which is third. So in that regard, if one were to offer a sacrifice, right? Let's say they were to sacrifice an animal in some ways, right? What is an animal? An animal is one of your exterior goods. Right? So giving one of your exterior goods towards God, well, that's good, right? That's fine. If you were to offer up, I'm going to go on a fast and I'm going to give up some of my meals, well, that affects your body. So affecting your body is even greater than your exterior goods, right? So, but then the highest of all would be to give up some sense of your pride, right? A matter of your internal um, soul. So obedience, another great line from St. Gregory, obedience is rightly preferred to sacrifice because by sacrifice another body is slain, whereas in obedience we slay our own will. So the matter of the soul, we're giving up a piece of our own will to God, which is better than giving up some possession we have. Therefore, giving your soul to God is more important, or giving your soul is more important. Now, if you were to, in this, again, next step, we're on step 3 or 4 now, anything which is given, which is not given in charity has no value, right? You can give up everything, but if you do it without love, it counts for nothing. First letter to the Corinthians. You can give up you can give up your life, but if you don't give it up in love, right? You can become a martyr, but if you're not a martyr of God in love, in charity, then there's no merit at all. So the same thing. So you can be obedient, but if you're not obedient out of charity, it's not that important. So therefore, charity is that greater virtue than obedience, right? Because you can obedience is still great, right? It's better than sacrifice because it's a matter of your soul, but it's not if it's not done in charity, it's not done. It counts for nothing. Uh, St. Thomas's response to objection 1, he also points out that obedience proceeds from reverence. Reverence to God, but also reverence to our earthly superior, that there's some level of respect given. Article 3. Now, oh, backwards. Now, Article 4, God ought to be obeyed. Well, this is quite obvious. I think that God ought to be obeyed. So, God is the first mover of all things that are moved naturally. So, He's first the mover of our all wills. Well, that's quite obvious. God comes first. So, God orders the world. So, God orders naturally superiors and allows them to be in control. Therefore, obedience to our superiors is natural, right? It's natural law, which that's good. But the first mover of even our superiors is God, right? So God is the first for all, right? Nothing else before that. Um, in God, nothing in nature is contrary to God. This is another one of those logical steps that St. Thomas is making. So nothing is contrary to God in nature because God is the author of nature, right? So in some ways, even the miracles are somewhat natural because God created the order. God created the whole system. Therefore, uh, Christ rising from the dead in some ways is natural to Christ's nature because that's the nature of divine beings. So it's somewhat natural, even something like the resurrection, because it's not contrary to nature. Grace builds on nature. Grace never destroys nature. Right? Augustinian approach um, builds up. He doesn't destroy. Um, now, and the extreme form is God ought to be obeyed. What if it appears that nature, that are, divine precepts would contradict God's command? Well, what St. Thomas is saying is that God's command can never violate divine precepts or natural precepts because God is the author of them all. So even with something, in response to objection 2, St. Thomas is really bringing up what we now would call divine command theory, which is not a popular theory today, but it would be the idea that if God says that something is good, that makes it good. It's not just that God says good things, not that simply that God is recognizing that which is good, but that God is the author of that which is good, and God can determine it very specifically. So, in the story of Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac, you say, well, how could God tell you to murder your own child? Well, if God commands it, then that's what is good. Now, if you recall, God also tells him not to do it. So, in that regard, God could demand it, but He does not demand it. So, the other part would be, and the next example he gives. This example gets brought up a number of times. When the Jewish people left Egypt, they borrowed all of this wealth from their Egyptian neighbors and then they keep it. So it isn't God telling them to steal. Well, St. Thomas says, well, everything that exists really belongs to God. Therefore, God can give it to whoever He wants. He can take it away from one and give it to another. So it um, uh, doesn't violate property because God can give it to whoever He wants. And then lastly, he points to what it translated as OC, but really we would say Hosea, the prophet Hosea, who takes an adulterous woman. That violates the precepts to take an adulterous woman. But uh, God is the one who oversees generation. God's the one who oversees procreation and new life and relationships. Therefore, if God says to do it, do it. The other caveat here is that Hosea, the adulterous woman he took was his own wife. So his wife was adulterous and he took her back. So, in all three of these examples of it seems like God is violating natural law, you can look at it and say, well, God was testing Abraham, but he didn't require him to give his own son. However, God does give his own son in Christ, but he did not require of Abraham. In terms of the wealth of the Egyptians, they enslaved these people for generations. The money they paid them in their loans, it was in some ways payment for their work of all those years of being a slave. Maybe that's not so unjust after all. And the adulterous woman that Hosea is commanded to take it back is his own wife. So again, perhaps not that unjust anyway. So St. Thomas kind of pulls these out as three kind of extreme examples of this kind of divine command theory. But in reality, God is still very much in control and very much just, even by mostly natural law standards as well, not just divine standards. Now, how about obeying one's superiors? Now, this one is a bit more surprising to me. I would have said, yes, obey your superiors, but the answer is really, it depends. Right? It depends. Should we obey our superiors? Well, probably in general, yes. Whether it's politicians or bishops or religious superiors or whoever your superior might be, your boss. And the quote St. Thomas uses in the contra argument is, we ought to obey God rather than men. Hopefully those go hand in hand, where God's law and our superior's law is the same. The precepts are the same. That's the goal. But if they're not, St. Augustine quote, if an emperor commands one thing and God another, you must disregard the former and obey God. Very good line. Now, one should obey your superior, but really only in terms of that superior's authority. Now, I think this is an important distinction. So, as an example, a soldier is obedient to their superior soldier, general, whoever their military leader is, in matters of war, but not in all matters, right? So part of it is Roman times, telling the soldiers, well, you need to offer some incense in front of the statue of the emperor to worship him as a god. Well, that's in religious matters. That's really not within the scope of the military leader to require this type of sacrifice to the emperor. So that's outside of the matter in which you should obey, right? It's outside the scope. Now, the servant in matter of work. So a servant obeys their master in terms of their duties at work. Well, that makes sense as well. If you say, please wash the floor and restock the shelves, that is within the scope of what an employee should do at work. If they say, well, you need to come back to my house and sleep with me, well, that is not within the scope of work. Right? That would be a violation of that. Or you must go to my church on Sunday. Well, that's not within the scope of work either, right? So they should be obeyed, but not as slaves. And even St. Thomas points out the example of a slave. Even the owner of a slave, and he's taking from Tully, Cicero. The owner of a slave doesn't own the soul of the slave. The most they can do is control the body of a slave, but you can't control the soul. The soul is still free. The soul belongs to God. Nobody can buy the soul, right? You can buy and sell people, but you can't buy and sell souls. The soul belongs to God. So a person must know what their limitations are. And then lastly, the example was of a son to a father. Now the father can direct things in matters of care of household or in terms of how to live one's life, but not in terms of who they're going to marry. Which is kind of funny because I would have thought that they would have had control over that, but a father doesn't have control over marriage of the child. And if the person wants to vow themselves to uh, chastity, virginity, uh, that is up to them, right? The parent can't decide that their child's going to become a, a religious. They have to make that decision for themselves. The parent doesn't pick necessarily who they're going to marry. Now, especially in the Middle Ages, probably they did a lot, but St. Thomas says that's really not properly obedience. Obedience, you still have control over some aspects of your own life. Now, the last article is should Christians obey secular power? Now, this is probably one of the more controversial ones as well. Not that everything isn't somewhat controversial with Thomas Aquinas, because our culture is so vastly, in some ways, so vastly different than the principles of St. Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle. Not always for the better. Sometimes maybe it is for the better. Up for discussion. If you're using this for class, this definitely leads to an area for a vibrant discussion. So, St. Thomas quotes Augustine, without justice, what else is a kingdom but a huge robbery? Now, this is from one of the objections, but I think that it's just such a great line. And the response to it doesn't make St. Augustine incorrect. Right? A nation should be built on justice. If it's not, it's just a huge robbery. um, now, the general principle is that Christians should obey their secular powers, and there's a number of wonderful quotes there. So, faith in Christ does not void the order of justice, but strengthens it. The order of justice requires that subjects obey their superiors, else the stability of human affairs would cease. Um, that is a great line, right? You could say, well, I am not of this world, right? I am of heaven. Therefore, I don't have to pay my taxes. I don't have to participate in the social life of the state. I don't have to worry about the common good of the state, right? I don't have to worry about the environment. I don't have to worry about the poor. I don't have to worry about anything because my life is of another world. St. Thomas says no, no. Um, uh, the proper stability of the common good is important for all people to start moving towards heaven, right? If everything is chaos and war and life looks like the Walking Dead, right? Where everybody's trying to kill one another and it's all just about power, it's hard to prosper. It's hard to uh, achieve holiness. It's hard to think that that would be God's will for this world, for us to be constantly in war with one another, with not only between nations, but between our own neighbors, that would be constantly in war with one another. That's not God's will. God's will is that we live in harmony and peace within each other, and that requires some level of stability, right? uh, this is somewhat countercultural today. This idea that we should try to live in peace with one another, um, but this is the goal, and the way that happens is following of the basic laws within a society. Now, it doesn't put God's stamp of approval on all of the laws of society, but we have to take a certain amount of it for granted. A certain amount of it, we just have to go along with it. We can work on changing it for the better, but we have to, in some ways, go along with it in general. Subjection is not of the whole person, but only part anyway, right? So the state has the ability to control certain parts of us. We can be obedient to the state, but only in certain ways, not in terms of the soul, not in terms of our our our, our hearts, right? Just in terms of certain external things. Um, and St. Thomas does point out, even in the response to objection three, uh, one is not essentially bound to obey an unjust prince. So if somebody uh, within your society, within your structures, is unjust or they have usurped power, then you do not have to obey them. But St. Thomas says, no, not essentially, but accidentally, right? So let's say you have somebody who's supposed to be an unjust president, uh, unjust dictator, whoever it is. Well, part of their unjust dictatorship might still be the collection of taxes, which pays for roads and schools and fire departments and police departments and national defense and clean water and social security, or so you can still pay your taxes even if they are unjust, because there's a certain amount of accidental qualities that still go along with this. There's a certain amount of um, goodness that still happens even when you have some sorts of tyrant as a leader. Now, you don't have to obey them in their tyranny, tyranny, right? You don't have to obey them in their tyranny, but you do have to, in some ways, you can obey them in the things you can, right? It's not to be uh, objectionable for the sake of being objectionable. You have to kind of pick your battles wisely in that regard, because you're still, even when Napoleon is emperor, he too will pass, right? He too will die, right? If anything, church history has taught us over the modern period, or the entrance into the modern period, is, you think Napoleon might destroy the church. No, he too will pass and the church will still be there. Communist China, it too will pass and the church will be there. It's not to get so up in arms about everything, but to realize, be obedient where you can, go along with what you can. What you can't, stand your ground, but this too will pass. I think that's that good balance of being in the world but not of the world. We don't find our salvation from worldly things, but we must exist in the world in some way. So, in conclusion, uh, men are bound to obey their natural superiors. Uh, it is a spiritual obedience is a special virtue because it deals with um, special people in authority. Obedience is not the highest virtue. Charity, justice is more superior than obedience. Obedience is a way to be just and to be charitable, but it's not in and of itself the highest virtue. God must be obeyed even before human beings, even to the point of divine command theory. Subjects must obey God above their superiors. So that's a little bit, seems like it's a nuance of question one. Man must obey their natural superiors, but if they are contrary to God, one must obey God above one's superiors. And Article 6, Christians are bound to obey their secular powers in order to uh, establish stability and peace. But if there is specific unjust acts of the prince, then one may obey God above the prince in that regard. But the goal is to go along with rather than to be constantly fighting with. Next, we will cover a very short section, disobedience, contrast to obedience.